introduction, and thank you to the National Rural Health Resource Center for having us today. My name is Paul Gehring. I'm a psychiatrist. I work at Align Health, and I'm here with...
my name is Amy Tappenfuss, and I work in the community engagement area here at Align Health as well.
And while these pictures put me on top and give me some fancy title, Amy's the one who's done more heavy lifting in this work than anyone I know. So I just want to recognize and thank her both for the work she's done and for being here with us today. I was a little taken aback by the invitation to come and spend some time with you all, because in some ways the work that we did here at Align felt very humble and homegrown, but we would not miss the opportunity to be with you, and I think really importantly for one reason. Our lessons on the back end of this are, while we would have done things differently and there were mistakes we made, this topic of stigma for mental health and addiction topics, patients and our people, is actually easier to do than we thought, and it was more impactful than we thought. And for all the things we might do different, I would hope that at the end of our time today, those of you who feel so inclined actually feel catalyzed to convert the potential of some action into actually doing something. And our hope in being here today isn't to tell you what to do. We're going to tell our story and through the background, but we're not going to be of any benefit to you if you don't feel fully empowered to ask the questions that are going to help you be successful and help you go from thinking about it to doing it. And so we planned for sure that we're going to keep the presentation short. We intentionally want time at the end for questions and answers. If you feel a burning desire to ask a question in the middle, go ahead and do that. Just text Keely in that chat function. She'll interrupt us, and we'll take that question real time. So, don't hesitate to ask a question, because I think that's really the most important part for us. So we're here to talk about this project we did, eliminating stigma around mental health and addiction conditions at our place here in Atlanta, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the surrounding communities. And we've been on a long journey, and one we've been pretty proud of for the care we provide, but we haven't ever done it perfectly. And I've had the delight of reporting directly to Penny Wheeler. She's an OB-GYN and is now our CEO. But long before she was my boss, and I had to report to her and whine to her about what was going good and what wasn't going good. And so she knew the nuts and bolts of what it was like in the hospitals and in the clinics and in the EDs for service, and what it was like for our employees. And my parting one-on-one with her before she left as my direct boss to become our CEO was, I really want you just to do two things. Remember, the work we've done internally, and keep an eye toward what can you do to help, and look to the community and ask what do we need to do to help. And I was a little taken aback because one of the very first opportunities she had as our CEO was to do something that our CEOs have always done. They do direct to the employees a communication with some regularity. So we've got almost 30,000 employees, and she, in her first communication, was extremely vulnerable. She talked about all kinds of important things organizationally that were big and common for CEOs, and you know what those messages sound like. But she also shared a story that was really heartbreaking, and it was a family friend of hers who had a child who had trouble accessing and receiving care in a timely way, and she held herself in that sort of very vulnerable spot. She was sharing it and said, you know, help me understand what you think we should do to close the gap. This is ours to do, and what are we going to do? And I think it was important for a couple of reasons. You know, first, it acknowledged we had a vulnerability. It acknowledged that we weren't perfect, and as a CEO, everybody in the company got it, and it didn't stay in the company. As soon as she said it, it started a conversation in the broader community. People shared it. There's sort of a urban myth or legend about it going viral outside of the line as well for naming something we all knew. We weren't doing as good as we could, and we had the potential to do better. And I got to tell you, that did an awful lot for galvanizing a lot of people who had that belief but didn't dare speak it. We're imperfect, even though we try hard. And it did another thing, because Penny ended the email saying, since I don't know what to do, and maybe we don't yet collectively know, what do you think we should do? And she got a lot of responses. I think my notes here say she got 200. My recall was a lot more because I had to read them after she read them, and we organized a lot of our work that followed for the next couple years around them. But there was a real strong and common thread, and it was about sort of setting a foundation to saying we do stigmatizing things here. Our patients tell us we don't do the job we could. We see it amongst ourselves. We feel it as employees who have mental illness. And if we're going to take treating mental health and addiction seriously, we need to make a commitment to addressing stigma. And that became really compelling, and we did some targeted work that ended up eventually being called Be the Change. But, you know, like any new project, you sometimes can be ready to launch something and have a moment of doubt. I remember the exact meeting where Penny said, so we're pretty close here. Are you sure this is the right thing to do? Are we going to be launching the right thing? And being the insecure guy that I am, we called a bunch of people together and thought we'd get, 15 or so leaders across the organization just to affirm, here's what we're thinking. Is it the right thing? And I remember that day also because we said 10 to 15 people and 40 to 50 showed up. And they were leaders and directors and supervisors gut-wrenching clarity, but it was a resounding yes, and hell yes, we should do this. And that was sort of the birth of our Be the Change effort, and from there our work followed. And the goals were really around, three things. One, to raise awareness that it's a problem and that we need to recognize it. We need to recognize it amongst ourselves, and we need to recognize it for our patients. And we actually set the bar lower in our leadership planning. We were going to say reduce stigma. They were unequivocal that the goal needs to be to eliminate it, which takes us down a much longer path and a different work product. The second goal was to really harvest the real stories that were all around us, and the more we made room for them, the more our leaders were willing to step up and share them. And the third was to engage employees to actually take this work. That would be the stigma elimination product that we had. So that's the way we were born, and I think that naturally, the thing I would urge you to do, if you think that there's a ripeness at your shop, is to reflect on are you where we were in one form or another? Is there a sense of your organization is really ready? And there are a lot of pieces to it. We're going to speak to that a little bit later. But I do think you need to recognize, unlike a food drive or a charitable contribution, this is not a one-and-done activity. It's an activity that will start at one place. It will move through others, but it really starts saying our culture is going to be different when we're done. And we have sort of a poor man's definition for culture here, which is how do we behave when Penny's not in the room? And so it really is a long journey, and you have to be ready for it. I think the other is just to be sure that there's the sincere alignment and interest in doing the project. And you have to be able to ask that question of what are we doing and why, and how does it fit in the organization more broadly. If you've got those two, I think you're ready to go. So our program itself had 5 basic elements, and they include that it's a leader-supported activity, that it's an employee-led, that there be some focus, that we don't have to boil the ocean, that we put some parameters, especially in the start, about what that looks like and let that develop, that we shape the activities with communication that support it and amplify that, and actually make it easier to do the work, and that over time we don't do the same thing over and over again, but we have a variety that matters to the people who are doing the work. Part of our story, I would say, that's one of the things we're learning more potently, is what does it take to keep the material fresh, and we can share that with you a little bit later. In the first of those 5 elements, the leadership support, we really did want a high level of support, and Penny was confident. Having your CEO go out in public and have the board be behind her makes it really easy, but that needs to be able to also translate below your CEO. It's got to be your division level leaders. In our case, it included 12 different hospital presidents, service line presidents, and we had to have them all be able to stand and articulate what are we doing and why are we doing it, and why are we doing it now. a lot of them actually had some difficulty and were really wise in recruiting help. And almost all of them had people in their leadership teams that were willing to tell a story. It could be the story of a family member, it could be their own story, it could be a peer, it could be a patient. But I think in that first 6 months, I went to at least 50 town hall meetings or staff meetings where it would be all staff, and the local leader would be able to amplify what Penny said, connected very proximally to the people who are on their site, and let his leaders and his staff actually speak to it. And I think one of the things that was early on easy to amplify, this is the right thing, is the number of people who would say, I want to tell my story, and I want to be involved in the work as it moves forward. Part of this is also not just being able to use that emotional voice. This matters to me because a problem I have, it's a problem I see with my family members. It's about a patient I took care of and it didn't go well. And that very proximal connection, but also be able to link it to our strategies broadly. How good is our continuum? Are we helping people be at their best? Are we waiting only until they're really sick and they need to be in the hospital, or are we able to intervene early? Can we meet them on their journey and help them be successful? These are things we always say we want to do, but to actually link it to those strategies and projects we've always had was important. One of the leader support issues that was important was to be able to ask the question with pretty good candor. So is this for everyone at Alina, or is it only for employees? What are we going to do the first time Dr. Smith says that thing he always says, or does that thing he always does? Are we going to have the courage as leaders to say, you're not excused from this, and these are the behaviors and the attitudes and the feelings that we're actually working to remedy and remove from the workplace? And that encouragement that this is clinicians and everybody who supports clinicians and nobody's off the hook from the cultural change was important, and to be sure to be consistent with the message. We're going to start at one place and we're going to move through a lot of things, but when we're done, it's not because we're done. This will be an ever fresh project where as we get better and we lift our bar higher, it's never going away. Part of our culture going forward. I'm going to pause and hand off to Amy to help me with some of the other components of the project.
Yeah. Excuse me. Thanks, Paul. I think one of the other things that we really wanted our leaders to be able to articulate and sort of support in how our teams were feeling. So when we think about articulating emotional and rational aims, one of the things that we're talking about is how do we want, not only how do we want our teams and our staff to behave, but it's also how do we want them to feel. We want them to feel pride. We want them to feel like they're empowered to do something to better the cause and eliminating stigma, but also to really understand, again, how it ties to the business, but what the impact of that has at the end, and what are we trying to accomplish with this. And so I think from a leader perspective, that was a really important role that they carried, because they made it okay for employees to be vulnerable and to be brave. And I think that's one of those things that, with the leader support behind you, if they came into a situation where, as Paula mentioned, Dr. Gary had mentioned, where there was a physician that was behaving in a way that was not in accordance with the RB the change effort, they had the power to have those conversations, and they knew they had the leader support behind it. So, and I think the other thing that what we would really recommend is having a strong provider as a leader as well, in terms of from a clinical perspective, because if we're talking about this related to clinical care, this is really like how do our employees eliminate stigma within themselves so they can provide better care, leave their bias at the door, and really being able for have that clinical support behind as well as we found was really important to being successful. And then finally, I would say that one of the things that Paul touched on was the marathon mindset, in terms of thinking about, as we look to this effort, knowing that it's not a one and done, it's not the food drive, it's not the big volunteer event. This is really like about shifting culture, and culture change is slow and it's hard, but the commitment needs to be there in order to really make the difference in the long run. Anything else you want to add?
Thank you for taking me back there. I think especially that sense of converting employees who might be discouraged or actually feel shame about some of the care we provide, and converting it to having pride. And I think some of the employees who have mental health conditions also, the sense of feeling welcome, feeling seen, feeling supported. I can't understate the value of that for how we feel together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what's interesting is after we launched Be the Change, you could feel a difference within our teams, in all of our business units, of just like it was almost like a different sense of connection. It was a really cool sort of, you can't touch it, like it was it's an intangible, but it was sort of like you could feel it in the air almost, like the energy sort of shifted.
I thank you for saying it, because I think one of the things that I see more than I ever have is people being able to tell stories in a way that connects to them and our purpose. And sometimes it's about pride, sometimes it's where we failed. But the courage to do it, and it's not the same people. Suddenly a leader who's not been involved will tell a story where it'll be a gut punch of, wow, where did that come from? And that sort of theme of people feeling empowered and comfortable, especially when it's vulnerable, is pretty cool.
Yeah, it was really cool. So how did we do this? So we had the leader support. One of the things that was really important to this effort was that it was employee-led. So we wanted to approach this with not just a top-down approach. We wanted it to be bottom-up, really. So this grassroots effort of engaging employees where they're at across the entire system. So we had people who were part of this effort who were from clinical care, who were from facilities, who were from administrative roles, HR, across the board. But what we did was is we put out this call for what we call Be the Change Champions. And our hope was that we would have one champion for every 100 people, basically. Like we just sort of chose a number and said we're going to have 260 champions. What we found when we put this call out is we had over 500 people sign up with bells on, knowing what the commitment was, knowing what it meant to do this, and they got the approval from their leaders to take the time to really invest in this effort as well. So what we did was with these 500 people, we went around our entire system. So we spent about 2 or 3 months training these champions in this 2-hour training, and it was dedicated time, had to be in person. But what the beginning of the training really was we spent probably at least a half hour, if not more, going over who was at the table, why they were there, what was there, and what they wanted to accomplish by volunteering to be the Change Champion. And that connection and hearing those personal stories and sort of feeling this like we're in this together, like we're powerful together, I think really helped to sort of bring this effort to life. And the other thing that did with that 2-hour in-person training was it brought safety to the conversation, because this was a place then where people could ask questions, they could be themselves, they could be vulnerable, they could share their experiences, and we were helping them to learn then how to translate that to sharing experiences and eliminating stigma with their team. So the trainings were really around like what is stigma, what are some of the causes of it, so where does it come from, and how can we address it amongst our teams. And then again, we also really focused on making sure that the employees do this as a marathon mindset as well, to be sure that this isn't a one and done. Like if you're in this, you don't have to, this becomes part of who we are as an organization, and really making sure that we don't forget that as we are eliminating stigma across our system, this is, they're changing the culture as they go. Every conversation they have is helping to change the culture. Every time they give a presentation, it's helping to change the culture and really build something that speaks to who we are as an organization, and really help us live up to who we want to be as well. Something you want to add?
Yeah, the other thing, just name it, I got to be involved in is we have new employee orientation. So if you didn't happen to be here when Penny sort of did the challenge, as we started talking about this and introducing champions and what were we doing, you didn't happen to be here. Every new employee got a little snippet in their new employee orientation about why we've chosen this, what we're doing, and what we ask of them as they join us, and that expectation. So it was something that felt like it started reinforcing itself, especially as the new employees came. And that's whether you were clinical or operational, so that helped a lot too.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Paul mentioned earlier, we really tried to have a focused approach to this effort. And so we chose to start with language as our focus for the first year, because language, I think, is something that everybody can relate to. We all use it. We all hear it. It's sort of, when we hear it, whether it's on TV or in the movies or just conversations, it sort of helps shape our perspective. That's where a lot of times we're from is just people using language. And so this is also one of those things where changing language, what it does is it sort of, as you think about your language, it forces you to pause. And when you pause, it's sort of, that's how you change internally and sort of like shifting your focus to eliminating stigma as opposed to just continuing on as you always have. And so we found that was really, really a powerful tool to begin with because people could relate to it and we could have conversations about it. But it also, what we also learned was, what we heard from our teams were, we want to bring it to the next level, like what's the next step as well. So starting with language, I think, was a really good approach in terms of like just educating people, getting people on board, helping them understand. But as they got into the effort, I think that there was a lot of energy around bringing it to the next level as well. And so as we went through this, we did really launched a really broad, targeted communications plan internally. So again, this was really focused only on our employees, but we really tried to reach every single person in the organization through one of our many channels. So it could have been through the intranet for weekly articles. It could have been through president's messages. It could have been in employee forums. It could have been Ronin screens. We sent a mailer to people's homes as part of our employee assistance program, and we created some videos to share as well. We also created marketing materials, so we had posters, flyers, buttons created, stick cards with a challenge. So a stick card is just like a third of a sheet of paper that explains the program, and then it has a challenge at the bottom and the challenge was, what are the 3 things you're going to do to eliminate stigma? And we had people write down this, because when you write something down, you're more likely to do it. And then when we shared in employee forums, we had, we really tried to bring in the stories and the why we're doing it, again, tying it back to our rational aims and our emotional aims. And what we found was I was in an employee forum with Dr. Penny Wheeler, and she was talking about Be the Change, and this woman, one of that was in the audience, just stood up and just started talking about how life-changing Be the Change was for her personally, as well as how proud she was to work for the organization, because she, again, had a personal experience with mental illness, and she started crying. I mean, it was just one of those where I think everybody in the room was like, oh my goodness, like the power of this program was way beyond what we ever could have imagined, I think. And I think that it affected people differently and sort of put a personal face to a lot of the mental illness and the struggles of people who love people with mental illness and addiction. And I think that the communications gave a lot of the facts, but it was those personal stories that sort of popped up everywhere that really brought it to life, I think, for many of the folks in our organization.
Maybe before you leave this targeted communication, you can see in the Change logo at the bottom and all the printed material, we've got that image, that's sort of the marketing image. It's interesting how, for both Be the Change champions, who all got a little lapel pin that they could wear, how recognizable that becomes, what a sense of pride there is that goes with it, and how they're sought out in their work groups. People know where to find them. So it's not a secret. You don't have to go to a list to find it, but they find each other, and it created a lot of sort of organic support at the work site.
Yeah, and and on top of that, I would also say that when we recruited those champions, one of the things that we asked them to do was to wear the lapel pin and be that safe space for their teams. So, I mean, again, this is talking about mental illness and addiction, and is very vulnerable for a lot of people. And we didn't want to ask people to become, therapists by any means. Like, that was not their role. We gave them a lot of tools of how they could, clinical tools that they could direct their teams to and their colleagues to. But really, we wanted them to be that ear for folks to provide that support on the ground, that to help those that were struggling within their teams and in their units, that to know that they weren't alone in this. So one of the other things that we did is we know that everybody learns differently and everybody receives information differently. So we really wanted to ensure that we had a diverse range of activities for people to engage with. So with this, we developed what we call the Champion Toolkit, and within that Champion Toolkit, we had PowerPoint presentations. We had what we called change checks, which it was like just a couple of minute activity or a video that we would engage teams in at meetings, and then we would ask them questions about stigma. One of the activities, as an example, was when you think of cancer, what are the first words that pop into your mind of somebody living with cancer? And so we hear a lot of like powerful, brave, strong, those types of things. And then when you think about somebody living with mental illness or addiction, what are the things that pop into your head? And some of those examples would be, weak or whatever. I can't even think of what some of the other examples were. But they had a negative connotation versus a positive connotation with cancer. And so that was just a way to get the conversation started in some of our meetings, so that people could sort of, again, going back to like that place of judgment, if you will, because that's where stigma comes from, is the place of judgment. How do you shift that focus or how shift that perspective to something a little more empathetic for folks living with mental illness and addiction conditions as well?
I think that was one of the more powerful exercises, too, to be able to sit and hear people say they associate danger or aggression or violence with somebody who's mentally ill, and then to have to sit with a peer who they've known all their life, who can say, do you feel that way about me? Really level setting for what's important and how do we talk, let alone how do we think about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the other things we did within this toolkit were we had huddle curriculum created, which is really short so that we could capture people where they're at within the clinical setting as well. So it was just like a 1 minute, where we had the unit lead give a fact about stigma, a fact about mental health or addiction conditions, and what we can do to eliminate stigma. Like, just really quick, everybody at the team received it. What is the challenge for the day that they could bring with them, whether it's leaving your bias at the door or listening for positive enforcement of the change activities or whatever that might have been. And then we also incorporated this into our wellness program, and we, so one of the things that we were able to do is add benefits, part of the, add activities within our wellness program so that people could earn points towards benefit rewards, if you will. And that was a really, another really powerful way to, number one, send the message. It would engage people in a meaningful way where they were actually like a captured audience and they signed up to do that. It wasn't us just like the passive communication. They actually reached out to engage in this activity. We promoted the non-meeting recovery walk. Those were really, really great representations of how do we get involved in community around activities that are related to mental health and addiction conditions. And then we had something called the Alternative Phrase Challenge. So this is one of the examples that we did across the system of thinking about how do we engage people differently. And so we gave them a stigmatizing phrase and said, send us what your alternative phrase to this is, and we we chose a winner from that, and then that was promoted as sort of a side-by-side of how do you shift language in a very simple way. But those are just a couple of examples of the activities that we did. Is there anything else you want to add, Paul?
No, I was trying to think of any of those alternative phrases, and none of them are coming to mind now. But it was nice to be able to have concrete examples where it's like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense, but it's not what I used to say. Yeah, exactly. Yep, and it just sort of makes you pause. Like one of the examples we used around language was when people say, I'm feeling very schizophrenic today. You know, what does that actually mean? It's like, I'm feeling very unorganized today. Like, how do you transition those, like the stigmatization of schizophrenia, just using it in a casual way to really, what are you actually feeling, as opposed to assuming what a schizophrenic may feel, and somebody living with schizophrenia may feel. And I think we knew from the very beginning this language and word piece was a proxy for helping us get to the things underneath. Yep. Nobody really cared that this exercise would be, that there would be word police. Yeah. It was the opportunity to use our language to help ground us. And what does this mean in this environment? Where's a good starting point? Yep, absolutely. That's a great way to put it. So, one of the other things we did is, from a champion engagement perspective, we also knew that we couldn't just recruit these 500 people and then let them go. Like, we really worked hard to engage them on a regular basis, so we sent them bi-weekly champion emails. We hosted lunch and learns. We had monthly challenges for our champions to engage in, and then we had a celebration at the end of our first year. We brought in a really powerful speaker who told her story about her experience with mental illness and how she overcame it to really, now she's an advocate for
people living with mental illness in the community and in her personal life as well.